Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this glorious day?
I am doing okay. It's been raining all day. We haven't had to build the ark yet. I'm thrilled with that because it's just like they're calling for 7 more days of rain.
I think the joke was both of us here in Pennsylvania, in May, it only rained twice, once for 12 days, the other for 13 days.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. And it seems like literally that was true. So,
Yeah, no, it,
but
it feels like it too, let me tell you.
mhm. Yeah, it's a bit humid in my office. A far cry from the last time we recorded, whenever summer still hadn't been here. It's like, well, yeah, there we go. But enough about the weather. We'd like to thank all of our subscribers, and once again, I've noticed that our subscribership on YouTube has been creeping up. We really do appreciate that. So if you're not subscribed, please do consider clicking the subscribe button that's down below. Click that thumbs up. If you're on Rumble, do the same thing. Please subscribe if you aren't already. Give us that like. On the audio platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts. So I mean, there's like 8 different ones that we're all part of the feed for. If you were to, continue listening on those, we'd appreciate it. Give us a good rating, I should say. Yeah, we really don't like the bad ratings, but I mean, yeah, we'll take honest feedback. And down below in the podcast description, you'll find everything about our podcast, the couple of Facebook groups we have, some links to your blog, Patty, your books on Amazon, buy me a coffee, link to our email where you can give us feedback, story ideas, pretty much anything you'd like to send us. Just don't send us bills because we can't pay them. Um, Maybe I'll cut that part out. Maybe I'll leave it in. I don't know. A little bit of comic relief. I'm only kidding about the bills, people. Um, and I think that's all I have to say. So, what is our topic for today?
So we are not quite done with the Appalachians, and I'm actually going to like split it up and do a couple more episodes, but further down the road a little ways.
Okay.
Now, if you're interested in the Appalachians, if folks are interested, please reach out and let us know. This is an area where there is so much history and so many stories. And among the things that are most well known about the Appalachians are the stories of the witches. They start way back in the late 1600s with stories of the first settlers coming in and witches and what have you, and move all the way through till today. There are still many of those stories. We're going to visit that. And the other things that are there are there's a theme of, of monsters and creatures, cryptids, of ghosts and hauntings. We're going to take a little kind of variety peek at a lot of different things, but sort of interrelated. So as I said, witches and witchcraft and stuff like that are very well known. I wanted to visit some stories. This is a story that dates back from the beginnings of folks settling in the Appalachian Mountains. There was a woman who settled in a little village in Virginia, and it was up in the mountains. It was a very cold area in the wintertime, and she had very pale light hair, almost white, and her eyes were very light blue. She was a very unusual looking woman from the sound of it. And I don't know if it was because of that or because of other things, but she got the reputation in the village as being a witch.
Hmm.
She
Okay.
kept to herself. She didn't speak English very well. She just, stayed off to herself. Now, in the same village, there, of course, were lots of children. And so one of the little boys, a little boy by the name of Jimmy, was well known that he was not a nice kid. He was about 10, 11 years old. He was a little bit of a bully. He had killed some chickens on this old lady's farm, this old European lady's farm, little farm area. And it was, well known who he was. Now, the village unfortunately gets gripped with an influenza type illness. They're sort of locked in up there in this little village because it's in the middle of winter, it's snowed, and they really can't go very far. There aren't any doctors within any feasible distance anyhow. So people are doing the best they can to save themselves and their children. And some people apply to this woman for some assistance, and she says she can't help. But it's during this time that this boy Jimmy kills her chickens, and it's because she refused to help. So Jimmy goes home, and a woman shows up at the house, and she talks to his parents, and his parents are denying it. No, not our son, kind of a deal. And the old lady's like, fine, fine. She goes home. That night, Jimmy finds himself having a bad dream. And it's this terrible dream that he has to go to the outhouse. It's way late in the middle of the night in the dream. And he goes stumbling out in this whirling snow because they have been just snapped with snowstorm after snowstorm. As he goes down, he feels like there's something or someone following him through the little path down to the outhouse. And in the dream, he turns around and runs back into the house. And every night for a week, almost 2 weeks, he has the same dream. And one day, the old woman manages to get up to Jimmy's home place, and she comes in and she says to the man and his wife, I know he's the one who killed my chickens, and I need recompense. I have no money. I need recompense. I can't get more chickens. And they're like, no, we don't know he did it. We don't have any ability to pay. We can't even give you chickens. We only have enough to take care of ourselves. And the old lady looks at the little boy and she says to him, You you will learn to be behaved. You wait and see. And she leaves and stumbles back down through those snowy trails. That night, he has this terrible, terrible nightmare. It's the same dream as before, but for some reason, it causes him more terror than it ever had in the past, even though they were frightening before. So he gets up in the middle of the night for real, has to go to the bathroom so bad, and he pulls his boots on and his coat, and he stumbles out into the snowstorm. It's whirling and snowing. It hasn't left up in almost 3 weeks for more than a few hours, and gets down there, and he gets that awful feeling that something or someone's following him. The snow is, it's like knee high, except where they had shoveled out. And he keeps stumbling along on the path on his way back up. And he's looking, and you know how you sometimes catch just a glimpse of something at the corner of your eye, and you're not sure it's really there, but well, you could have swore something just moved.
Yeah, all too well. Yes.
Yeah, that's how it is for this kid. So he rushes as fast as he can through this heavy snow back to the house, and it's basically what they call snow bright. Whenever you can see, because there's just so much, the snow reflects whatever little bit of light. And he goes in and he wakes his parents, and he's crying and he's saying, there's something outside, there's something outside, it follows me at night. And his father's like, that's ridiculous. And he's like, no, no, I'm telling you. And he's really insistent. So finally, his father gets up to shut him up. He fixes the fire and he says, come on, I got to go to the outhouse. You walk down with me. So they open the door. His father has lit a lantern. And there, highlighted by the light of the lantern, are two sets of footsteps going down and coming back. One definitely looks like the boy's,
Mhm.
and the other, larger, a woman's boot, perhaps. After that, it said that the boy behaved himself much better, and come spring, his family made amends with the old woman for the chickens that were dead. And the boy finally admitted what he had done. And only by doing so did the witch let him stop having the nightmares.
Well, I mean, it could have turned out a lot worse than that. So I suppose that's, as far as witch stories go, that's kind of tame. But
It is, and we're
mhm.
going to start out with a little bit of that. And I did want to talk about something called witch doctors, because believe it or not, in the Appalachian Mountain, there are stories of witch doctors, but not what we think of, like from South America and around Africa and what have you. These are not people who participate as witches. These are people who can cure spells from witches. So literally, like if you have the flu, you go to a doctor. If you
Okay.
get
Yep.
a curse put on you by a witch, you go to a witch doctor who will doctor you through the curse and get it broken.
Gotcha. Mhm.
So they're interesting because they're an interesting variation on the concept. And you only find them as witch doctors who will break spells and stuff in the Appalachian Mountains. Now, I want to go to a book. This book was written in 1975 by a guy by the name of Patrick Gaynor. Now, Patrick Gaynor was a professor of folklore in Glenville State College, and he shared and collected a lot of stories. He particularly worked in Clay County, West Virginia. That's where the vast majority of his stories came from. I wanted to share a story about a young woman named Ira. Ira was about 19 to 20 years old when she met a young man from a place called Booger Hole. Not exactly, but there is a place, by the way, named Booger Hole. I swear. I looked
Oh,
it up.
yeah. There could be worse names, so please. Yeah.
Right. So she met this young man with the last name of Thorne, and she fell in love, and he asked her to marry him, and they were getting ready to get married, and he said, "You got to come and meet my family." It happens all the time. She's real excited because she's going to get to meet his family, but he tells her that, he kind of warns her about Grandma Thorne. Grandma Thorne is supposedly a witch, and she's a little eccentric, and you got to kind of like smooth around her and what have you. And now the girl's a little apprehensive. So, um, and her people and people in the local area, that when they find out she's marrying one of the Thorne boys, they're like, "Oh my gosh, that old lady that lives up there with them, that grandma of theirs is a witch." So she's kind of got, her hackles up a little bit because she doesn't know what to expect or anticipate. But she goes up and she gets married. Now, um, Grandma Thorne was known throughout the entire area as a witch. And there were these stories, these old stories about how she had become a witch. So becoming a witch means that you had to create a pact with the devil. There are multiple ways to do so, but the most popular, particularly in the West Virginia area, is the one that follows. So what happens is you go to the top of a hill and you'd have a shotgun with a hanky, an old-fashioned cloth hanky, tied to the end of it, across where the bullet would come out. Okay, and you denounce God 3 times while turning around. You say you don't believe in God, the Father, the God, the Son, or the God, the Holy Spirit 3 times. And then you shoot this gun at the moon. So you obviously do it at night. And you do this for 3 nights of running. And at that point, the devil supposedly will show up, and he has a book and an iron pen, and he will hold the pen out for you to slit your skin and dip it in blood to write your name in the devil's book. And supposedly, Grandma Thorne had done so. Now, she was well known as interacting amongst the people, and she could predict things and tell things that other folks couldn't figure out how she knew. And one of the story is that right after Ira came to live there, there was this fellow by the name of Harold, and Harold borrowed Granny Thorne's horse. Her name was Old Fanny, the horse. Now, Old Fanny was getting to be an older horse, and this young fellow came and he borrowed the horse, and he said, "I need to plow need to plow a field so I can plant food for my family. Would you loan me the horse?" And Granny said she would, but under one condition. He had to make sure he didn't overwork the horse, Fanny, because she's getting old. So take your time. Don't push her too hard. The man said, "Oh, no problem. I won't do that. I won't do that." So the next day he comes bringing old Fanny back up, and she's just a mess. The old lady comes storming out of her house when she sees him coming up the lane, and this poor horse is dragging its feet. It's all caked in mud and dried sweat, and it hasn't been cared for, and it just looks like a mess. And she screams, "You ruined my mare. What are you doing?" And he's like, "Look, um, I'm I tried to use her as lightly as I could, but like I needed to get them fields plowed." And she was furious. And the old woman turned and she said, I put a curse on you. And she told him, she said, you're going to feel the pain of my old mare until I decide you're done. And the next morning, this fellow woke up and his muscles are all sore and he's got knots in his hair and he's got red markings on the side of his mouth as if something had dug in there all night and what have you. And that day, he looked just like death warmed over. For weeks, he couldn't sleep without that restlessness. He felt like he woke up every morning having run a marathon. He was exhausted and he just couldn't believe it. He went up and he begged Granny Thorne to stop. Please just stop. He said, I just can't do this no more. And she raised a hand and she said, I will take that curse off of you. But she said, for one thing. And he said, what? She said, I know something you did that was just despicable. You murdered a fella down in town, and she named the man. And he said, what are you talking about? She said, don't you be lying to me, boy. I know what you did with him. And all I want to know is where did you bury him? And he said, well, it wasn't me. I don't know where he's at. And he took off. Well, a few days later, Ira's there. Now she's been married for about a year. She's just given birth to her first baby, and she's invited a few of the girls from town she grew up with out to the farm, to her husband and her little place, and to see the baby. You know, it was that kind of almost like a baby shower thing. They brought little booties and cute little things, and Grammy was invited, so Grandma's up there, and she she's kind of putting a damper on things because she turns around and she says, you know the stonemason in town who died? They're like, well, we know the stonemason left town. She said, ain't no way he left town, girls. I'm going to tell you, one of you was married to a murderer. And the women were obviously, it kind of ruined the baby shower thing. And Ira was really angry and upset. And she was like, you know, Grandma, why would you do that? And she's like, because I'm telling you, before this next 2 weeks is up, I'm going to expose who that fellow was who murdered that man who built the chimneys in the houses in town. Well, now, Granny at night, she would put blankets over her windows so as you couldn't see any light and it wouldn't draw the bugs in, because in the summer you got to leave the windows open to get a little fresh air. One night, right after this happens, Granny hangs her blankets up across the windows and she's sitting in her cabin and it's pretty dark, just the tiniest little bit of light, and just kind of rocking and just relaxing. And all of a sudden, somebody moves one of those blankets off the window just by a hair, and a gun goes poking in, and Granny gets shot. Well, of course, everybody remembered what she had said about the stonemason in town. And, you know, they laid her out to rest and what have you. But it said that she had cursed whomever that man was. And the next day, after she was dead, a man came into town from one of the local farms and he confessed and he said, you got to make that old witch stop. I thought I shot her last night. I thought I killed her. I thought it was all over and done with. But she's been haunting me all night long. And she said she ain't never going to stop. And people thought he was crazy at first, except for, of course, the fact that while he was telling the sheriff this and asking for help, something smacked him across the face and his head went spinning a little. And then something smacked him again and he stumbled. And it just looked for all the world like someone was beating him. And people said, well, you know, I'm pretty sure it must have been Granny. And they say Granny didn't stop until he was walking up on the scaffolding to get hung, because she was going to take justice one way or the other. Now, when the first Europeans came there, of course, they met a lot of the native people, and they sort of settled in amongst them and began to learn and what have you about them. And the native people began to get sick because people didn't understand diseases. And if you're exposed to a disease you've never had, it'll sweep right through a little village and it'll take people. And so even though the Europeans didn't realize that's what was causing it, that's what was causing it. And this little girl, this little native girl, she just catches whatever this ailment is, and it makes her skin sore, and she's just as ill as can be. And no matter what the doctor, the old ladies at doctor did, they couldn't stop her, and she passed away. And they said that right after she died, you would hear her singing a distant song. And they say that to this day, you'll hear her singing. And if she calls out your name, or particularly the name of a child walking by, you best keep 'em moving. Don't let your kids out in them woods up there in that hollow where she died, because she'll call to them as though she's just a little girl, and they'll see her in the distance, and she'll lead them off until, well, until they die. She won't bring them back, and they'll be found days later dead. Now, there's a story that I wanted to share. There was a gentleman in this little town, and he was a fairly wealthy man, come from a nice little city, and he invested a lot of money. This would have been in the early 1800s, and he did pretty good. He loaned money, he invested money, he was actually pulling it off and doing a pretty good job. And then all of a sudden, it just seemed like he had some bad luck and he went bankrupt. Now, one of the things he had done when he was flush is he had bought a lot of land, forested land out in the hills. So he decided that he was going to try to put up a sawmill. And if he could mill the lumber and sell it, he might be able to pay off his debtors and get himself back right, on his feet and what have you. So he told his wife and his only child was a daughter. She was in her late teens, and she was pampered. She had all the finest clothes, and she hung out with all the right folks and everything. And he brought them together one night, and he told them he was bankrupt, that he was going to take the clothes and the fancy rings and all the jewelry and stuff that his wife and he had and his daughter had, and sell it. And with that, they were going to buy the fixins to build this mill. And he explained the whole process. Well, now his wife understood, and she was like, okay, I'm in. But the daughter was another matter. The daughter was not a happy camper. She did not want to go out and live in the sticks. She wanted to stay in town. She wanted to have, parties and just continue on the way things had always been. And she pitched such a bitter arguments against him. But at the end of the day, he up and packed them all up, took all her finery and her fripperies and stuff and sold it all, and bought the stuff to make the mill. Went out into the woods. They built a little 2-room house to live in, which I'm sure really vexed this girl, because she come out of a fine mansion and now she's living in a 2-room house. And down below on the side of the hill, he built a little shanty. That was for the guy who was going to run the logging. That was kind of his supervisor's little hut. And they got the mill up and running, but it didn't seem like it was doing a good job. Like everything just sort of had problems. The first thing that happened was he hired himself a manager, a fellow who was knowledgeable about running, logging mills. And he gave him the house, and he told him, he said, you go ahead and you stay there, and that's part of your pay, and I'll pay you this much money. And everything was just beginning to kick right. And then all of a sudden, one morning, he didn't show up for work. And the fellow went down and knocked on the door to see what was up, and there wasn't no answer. So he opened the door, and laying on the ground with his face and neck all clawed apart was this supervisor for the mill. Well, everybody said he must have been attacked by a wildcat or something. He looked pretty bad, but there was no indication of how it got in. The door was latched and what have you. So the fella buried this man and sent out word that he was looking to hire somebody else who was knowledgeable, and he hired that fella. And that fella come, he took up a cabin there, that little shanty that he had, and he made sure, because he had heard the stories, he made sure he put good heavy locks on those doors, and he kept them windows boarded up at night with shutters on the inside. Nothing was coming through there. And he got himself a fancy lock and with a key and all. And he built that right on into that door, reinforced everything. For a few weeks, he was doing mighty fine. And then one morning, he didn't show up. So the fellow walked down and checked to see what was going on. I'll be doggoned if he wasn't laying there dead just the same way. Door locked from the inside. They had to break it open in order to get into him. But there he lay, and there was nothing disturbed except for just him being all torn up, his throat slit open and blood everywhere. The fella didn't know what to do, and nobody wanted the job now because it didn't seem to have good odds, if you know what I'm saying.
Mhm.
So this guy was a nice man, this guy that used to be rich. And so a fella come along a few weeks later and said, he needed some work. And he said, well, I've worked in lumber mills before. I could help you out for a few days. I can't promise you I'll stay forever, but I can help get you back up and running in exchange for, room and board for a few days so I can get back on my feet. Seemed like a fair enough thing. The guy said, sure, we'll do that. And he said, I hear there's a shanty down there that's for the supervisor. And he's like, I don't think you should want to move into that. And he's like, well, I can't sleep at your house. You got 2 rooms, you know? And he's like, well, I just want to tell you the truth. So he told him the story about the 2 supervisors. And this fella, he said, well, now I got me something I got to talk to you about too, because I'm not traveling by myself. I'm traveling with this pet bear. He's out there in the woods. I made him sit, but he's like a dog. Like I've had him since he was a little cub, and he just sort of wanders wherever I go. Now, I'll hunt for food for him. I'm not expecting you to pay for him to eat, but I want him to be able to stay with me in that there shanty. He's tame as can be. Like I said, he's tame like a dog, real used to folks. And we usually make a bit of a living by showing up in towns and people come to see him and me interact. We wrestle a little bit and do different things, but I just need a place to crash for a few weeks and kind of rest. I got injured, not by my bear, but by somebody else a while back. And he's like, well, as long as the bear's tame and as long as it doesn't cause any damage, sure, you can have the bear. So the fella moved into the thing and he locked it up tight and he brought his bear inside with him at night. It was his 3rd night there. And he's sitting there. He's got a little candlelit fire in the little mud and daub. It's called a stick and daub fireplace. And he's just smoking his little pipe and having a good time. The bear's laying out, stretched at his feet, enjoying that warmth and they're all getting ready to lay down and sleep. When all of a sudden, the bear sort of turns and he growls. The man looks, and coming right from the shadows in the darkness by the door is this cat. Big old cat. And it was slinking into the room there. And in the last second, it took a big flying leap up at that man. And just as it did, that bear caught hold of it and flipped that thing and literally ripped the paw right off it. And that thing yowled and screamed. And this is what the fellow told the guy had hired him. He said the next morning, he said, that thing turned into smoke or mist or something like that. And it went right through that keyhole and out. And he said, I'm telling you, it wasn't no real cat. And he said, how do you know? And he said, on account of this. And he pulled out of his pocket this bloody rag and he flipped it open and there was a girl's hand, a woman's hand there. And the man recognized the ring on it as his daughter's. And he gasped and he said, oh my God, come with me. And they went running up to the house and his daughter's in bed and she's all tucked in her bed, in the corner. And she's like, I don't feel so good, Papa. I'm not getting up right now. And he's like, show me your hand. And she lifts up her right hand and she's like, why? Everything's okay. He says, show me your other hand. She says, oh no, I'm so warm. I don't want to do that. He rips the blankets down and her hand is gone. They say in that moment he shot her dead because he realized her hatred and her anger at him having to sell that stuff had made her turn herself into a witch so she could shapeshift and ruin things for him. because she kept telling him, and he remembered it from the very beginning. I'll make sure that you can't make anything out of that place, Papa. And she made sure to the point of selling her soul.
That's some spite.
That is spite. So when you think about the Appalachian Mountains, of course, folks think about the Appalachian Trail. And before we finish our part two, I wanted to visit that. Hiking along the Appalachian Trail it's got all kinds of really interesting things that happen. The Appalachian Trail runs from Alabama all the way up, through United States, and it's huge, thousands of miles. There's people that walk it, and it takes a year. And anybody who's not familiar with it, there are way stations, and there's like rustic cabins and shelters and all kinds of stuff. We're going to be talking a little bit about that. In 2011, there was a fella who was going to take part of the Appalachian Trail. A lot of folks don't walk it all at once. They'll take a vacation and walk for a week. Then they'll go home, and they'll do it again before fall, and they'll walk a couple weeks a year on the Appalachian Trail. And obviously, you're out in the middle of the woods with whoever. There's lots of folks traveling. Sometimes you meet really nice people, and folks will kind of bed down in the same area just to have some company. And other times you meet people that are a little bit creepy, and you just want to make sure you're not bedding down in the same area as those folks. So that's kind of what happened to this fella. He was just moving along, having a good week's vacation, had a tent and a backpack, and some provisions. And at the end of the week, he had a family member that was going to come pick him up at where he was going to walk to and come off the trail. Well, on his second night there, he saw a fella walking behind him, and he thought, you know, hey, how you doing? The guy was just walking, but staying back in the darkness and the shadow. You could see him moving, but you couldn't see him clear. And he thought, well, he yelled a couple times, hey, how you doing? That kind of stuff, and nothing. So the guy's like, okay. So he kind of hitches himself off to the side of the path there, finds a wide spot, and thinks, I'll stay here. And this other fella keeps it going. It's just as darkness is beginning to fall, so he can't see him very well. And he gathers up a little bit of firewood and sets his tent up real quick. It's a little pup tent, doesn't take much to do. Heats himself up a little bit of something to eat, and he's sitting there. And he notices that where he had gotten the wood from, there was some other brush he had drug out to burn up throughout the night. And he saw a man standing there. And he's watching the fella, and he thought, that's just weird. And he yelled to him again, and the guy turned and walked into the woods. He's like, that's crazy. Well, maybe it wasn't the same guy. For the next 3 nights, he sees the same guy, time and time again. Hears him walking around outside while he's trying to sleep. You can imagine it does make sleep really difficult when you hear things like that. On the 5th night, he's built the fire up pretty high. He's got his knife now in his, on his belt, because he's getting pretty anxious. And finally, he's sitting there finishing up, kind of letting the fire die down a little bit. Guy comes walking out of the woods. And this is what I wanted to hear. He said the following day, he'd been hiking, and this is the end of the evening. He said, I saw this man standing near my firewood. His hands and his body fell into the firelight for the first time. And this is what I saw. His body was badly burned, his hands, and his face was literally smoking. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I stared at him before the thing turned and walked away. I was scared, and I packed up my stuff and I left the area. I wasn't about to stay in them woods with whatever that was that I saw. I knew there was a place you could get off the trail, so I went down there and I caught some cell service. And I called the police, and I said, there's this crazy man in the woods. I think you better look. Now, just for the people to understand the reason the sheriff would take this really serious, there are about 4 people every year that disappear on the Appalachian Trail. At least 4 that aren't found. So the sheriff came out, and he said, told him, he said, just stay where you're at, son, I'm on my way. And he walked back in onto that trail with this fella to that area, and he said, "What did you see?" And he had kind of turned, just said it was crazy man. He was all messed up. Fella was, kind of like a do or die moment. He said, "Well, I'm going to tell you, but you're going to think I'm crazy." And he tells him this whole story about how this thing had been following him, how it would come out of the woods and watch him from the darkness, and how on this night it stepped close enough he could see it in the firelight, and then what he saw. And the fella said, the sheriff, he said, "Son, are you telling me the truth?" And he said, "Look, do you really think I want you to think that I'm crazy? I'm just telling you what I saw." He said, "Son, if you were walking about the average rate, back not too far from where you picked up the trail, on the first night you would have been in these woods, there was a house that burnt down up there. The whole family burned to death. And the body of the man, he's missing. We found the wife and the kids, but not his." And he's like, "Maybe that fellow was just badly burned." He's like, "Dude, I'm telling you, his face was smoking. There's no way he's alive." And he's like, "Well, Oz will play curious tricks. They hunted them woods for quite a while. Never did come up with him again." But that begins something that becomes a recurring story on the Appalachian Trail. In 2011, a few weeks after this happened, another man took the Appalachian Trail. Same area. Had no idea what had happened because it wasn't publicized yet. One evening, he's sitting by his fire, and he said, this is what it says. It says, I was relaxing by my fire, and I was startled when I realized there was a fella standing close to my fuel at the edge of the firelight. And when I looked up at him, his face caught fire, and his hands and his body caught fire as though he were covered in fuel, and the charred figure stared at me with empty eyes. I was too terrified to move. And then all of a sudden, it turned and it walked into the wilderness. Dripping fire, but nothing caught fire. No flames caught the leaves or anything. And he said, I packed up as quick as I could and I left the place. If you go on to the sites or websites for the hikers, you're going to find multiple people have had this encounter since that time. So we're looking at from 2011 upward. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human anymore. There's another story of a young couple in the Virginia section of the trail, and they were hearing odd noises around their tent at night. There's animals and what have you, that's why you keep your stuff up and what. So at first that's what they thought they were hearing. But after this happened on the second or third night, the fella decides he better get out and scare off whatever this is. So he opens the flap on the tent and he yells out, shines his flashlight around, and that's not what he saw. What he saw were figures, human figures. They were all around, and one of them yelled, I bet you can't catch us. And it took off running, and then the others took off running down the trail. And he's like, I had no desire to go after them. So I poked my head back in, and I packed everything up, and I told my girlfriend, we're going to go on down to the next area, and then from there the next morning we'll be able to find the path off the trail. So they packed up everything, and they took it down as far as they could, and they were unable to read and see very well in the dark. So they decided to pull off into this one area and just set up the tent, and they decided to pull out their guns. They had guns with them. And he sat up for a while, and she slept a couple hours, I'm sure not very well. And he said, we started to hear it again. They were around the tent, something, and it was like a person. They would hit the tent, and then they would back up, and you could see the silhouette of a human being. And I knew it was them. So finally I yelled out and I said, if you don't move, we're going to start shooting. And whatever we hit, mister. And his girlfriend woke up and they started to shoot through the flap of the tent. And as they walked the rest of the way out the next morning, they could see them behind them. 4 of them, male, walking along, staying just far enough away you couldn't see them real clear, but making sure you could see them well. And they followed him till they turned off to go to this little, it's like a little shop that's along the edge of the trail, and people would leave messages for family members that were walking, and you could get food and water and what have you. And when they got in there, they called the police and told them what they had seen. One of the policemen who came out walked back in there, and he said, came out a couple hours later, and he said, we've been having stories of this for a long, long time. I don't know who or what these things are. Now, there are stories that there are feral people in those woods, people that went and never came back, living back in there, and that they make their living by killing folks or stealing things from people. And that's how they survive. I'm going to tell you one last story and then we'll call it quits for this night. There was a young lady by the name of Janice Balza, Balza. You can look her up. She was a real person. In the 1970s, she was backpacking and she was doing it by herself. Now, she had backpacked for a long time. She was very knowledgeable about it. She was in her mid-20s, had been doing it since she was in her early teens. Wasn't at all concerned. This was out near a place called Carter, Tennessee. And she came across a fella who walked into her area where she was sitting, and he started talking to her, about her age, maybe a little older, and struck up a conversation. And he asked her if she'd like to come and they could eat together that night. It's kind of lonesome and have a little conversation. She said that was a fine idea. And she met him. They walked down the trail and they got their little tents set up. And, it was kind of nice to not be by yourself the whole time. And they had dinner, each of them cooking whatever it was they brought, sharing the food. And true story, he pulled a knife out and he stabbed her to death. He would go down the road, break into a house, and confess to the people that he murdered a girl on the Appalachian Trail. Well, you can imagine they were pretty happy to call the cops, and the cops came out and he told the cops the same story. And he had her backpack with him. And the cops walked in and checked, and they arrested him, of course. And turns out he murdered her because he liked her backpack. He was a former mental health patient. He had been released from a mental facility. His name was Paul Bigby. And that's why he murdered her. The shelter where she was murdered is, it's called the Vandeventer shelter, the Vandeventer. And it is still accessible on the Appalachian Trail. And you can go there. It sits there, a little stone shelter you can, sleep in or store your stuff in while you're sleeping. People go there all the time to take shelter. Well, I don't suppose you'd be surprised to find out more than a few of them have talked about hearing a girl crying, feeling like there was somebody there with them. And then later on they leave and they go back home and they look it up. I'd like to read you one story. This is a gentleman who wrote on one of the websites. This past Saturday, myself and two friends stayed at the Vandeventer shelter. I did not know that in the 70s there was a murder of a girl named Janice Balza until I got home and Googled the shelter. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I woke up in my tent. For 10 seconds, I heard stomping noises like a runner coming down the trail. It stopped right in front of my tent. There was a yell and a growl. No response. I yelled a couple times, then more stomping and running as though somebody was trying to get away. Next morning, I mentioned to my buddies in the other tent what had happened. And one of my friends said, "Hey, that's crazy because at 2:30 I had the same experience. I thought it was you goofing off." It wasn't. And then he says, "Has anybody else ever had any experiences at the Vandeventer?" And indeed, If you look the websites, you will find out there's a lot of experiences there. So every part of the Appalachian Mountains, including the trail, are badly haunted. By the way, there are some other really bizarre murders, including two serial killers who hunted the Appalachian Trail in the 70s and 80s. So I don't recommend you going by yourself. Isolated people tend to be the ones that get attacked right away. And I'm not saying there's a lot of that, but enough that I wouldn't want to take that chance. And with that, I'm going to leave everybody tonight, but you should check out the story. It's quite an interesting story, and there's several others as well. Several couples who were murdered along there, and like I said, a serial killer who murdered several people, including a couple couples. That, good night.